Orson Pike's thick fingers closed around Mara Bellamy's wrist like a trap snapping shut. She didn't scream. She had learned that screaming only made men like him feel powerful. He yanked her off her feet beside the creek, her wet laundry scattering across the mud, and when she stumbled, he didn't slow down. He dragged her, barefoot, through gravel, down the center of Main Street, while 38 people stood on wooden sidewalks and watched like she was something being hauled to the garbage heap outside of town. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. That was the moment Mara Bellamy understood that a town could exist while you were still breathing. And that was the moment two little stepped-into-girls stepped into the road and changed everything. If this story touches something in you, the part that remembers what it felt like to be overlooked, or to finally be seen, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. I want to know where in the world you're watching from. So drop your city or country in the comments below. Let's see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Willow, Wyoming. 1887, the day that changed everything. The summer of 1887 came to Red Willow, Wyoming, like a punishment. The creek dropped to half its usual depth. The cottonwood trees along the main road shed their leaves 2 months early, as if even they wanted to leave. The air smelled of dust and dry cattle, and something else, something harder to name, the particular heaviness that settles over a town that has made up its mind about someone and is simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. Mara Bellamy had felt that heaviness for 8 months. She'd arrived in Red Willow 2 years earlier as a new bride, full of the cautious hope that belongs to women who've had enough hard years to know hope should be rationed carefully. Her husband Caleb had seemed steady, quiet, a man who kept his word, paid his debts, said please and thank you to waitresses and stable boys alike. Mara had thought that was enough. She had thought steady was the same as safe. Caleb was dead by the following spring. Fever took him in 10 days. She'd sat beside him through every one of those nights, changing the cloths on his forehead, talking to him about nothing, the weather, a bird she'd seen on the fence post, whether the corn would come up well that year, just to fill the silence that kept trying to swallow them both. On the 8th night, he'd squeezed her hand once, deliberately, like he was trying to tell her something. On the 10th morning, he was gone. Mara had been 26 years old. What followed was the education that nobody warns young women about. Within 3 weeks, the creditors had come. Within 2 months, the house was gone it had been borrowed against. Caleb's debts stretching back further than Mara had known, and she'd learned then that a wife is often the last person to understand a marriage's finances. She didn't blame Caleb. He hadn't been dishonest. He'd simply been optimistic in the way that kills people, spending against harvests that hadn't arrived yet, borrowing against land that the bank considered theirs first. She moved into a rented room above the saddle shop. Then, when the money ran out, she moved into a smaller room behind the laundry. Then there was no room at all, and she's learned to be creative about where she slept. The church hall on cold nights, when the Reverend was feeling generous. The hay barn at the eastern edge of town, when he wasn't. One terrible week in February, she'd slept on the Beaumont family's back porch, wrapped in a horse blanket she'd bartered laundry work to obtain, listening to them eat supper 8 feet above her head. She washed other people's clothes to survive. She mended shirts and dresses for pennies. She did not ask for charity because she had watched what charity did to women, how it gave men the right to look at you a certain way, to talk about you in that particular tone that meant they decided you were beneath deciding anything about your own life. She ate what she could. She went hungry when she couldn't. And through all of it, she kept herself clean, kept herself quiet, kept herself small enough that Red Willow might decide she wasn't worth the trouble of noticing. But Red Willow noticed anyway. The rumors started quietly, the way rumors always do, not with a shout, but with a whisper over a fence post, a significant look exchanged across a general store counter. Someone said Mara had been seen talking to a married man outside the hardware store. Someone else said she'd been asking questions about a rancher's finances. The truth of these rumors was irrelevant. What mattered was that they provided Red Willow with a framework, a story about what kind of woman Mara Bellamy was, and once a town has that story, the facts become inconveniences to be edited out. By early summer, she couldn't buy flour from 3 different stores. The women who'd paid her for laundry began finding reasons to take their washing elsewhere. She'd walk into a room and conversations would lower in volume until she left. Then rise back up behind her like water closing over a stone. On the morning everything changed, Mara was kneeling beside the creek at the edge of town, scrubbing a shirt that old Hendricks had given her last paying customer, a 70-year-old man who was mostly blind, and therefore couldn't see what the rest of the town thought of her. The water was cold. Her knuckles were cracked and bleeding in 2 places. She was thinking about whether she had enough for bread and whether she could reasonably eat half a loaf today and save the other half for tomorrow, and whether that math would still leave her functional enough to work. She heard the footsteps before she saw them. 3 sets. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that carry intent. She stood up from the creek bank and turned around, and Orson Pike was already close enough that she had to take a step backward not to be looking directly up into his face. He was a large man, Pike, the kind of large that came from prosperity rather than labor, the softness of good living packed under the impression of size. He ran the general store. He sat on the town council. He had 3 grown sons and a wife who smiled at everything he said. He was not smiling now. "You're done here," he said. Just that. The same way he might tell a stray dog it was done sleeping on his porch. Behind him stood Walt Prescott, who owned the livery, and Jacob Corin, who had no particular business in town except that he liked being where trouble was. Both of them had the look of men who'd already decided this was justified and were waiting for it to be over. Mara had learned this the long, slow, humiliating way, that there was a kind of man who needed a woman to argue so he could feel righteous in what came next. Kept her voice flat. "I'm working, Mr. Pike." "Not anymore, you're not." He stepped forward. "Red Willow doesn't want you here. You know that. We've all made that clear enough. Now you're going to walk yourself out of this town and keep walking, or we're going to help you along. I have the right to be here. You have no rights here." He said it like a fact. "Whether you're a burden and a bad influence and a..." He used a word. She had heard the word before. It didn't hurt the way it once would have, which she supposed was either growth or damage, and she could never tell the difference anymore. She looked past him, toward the street, toward the wooden sidewalks, where people moved through their days, doing their shopping, exchanging their pleasantries, and she understood in that moment, with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose, that not one of them was going to help her. Then Pike grabbed her wrist. His grip was a shock. Not because it was physically the worst thing she'd ever experienced. She'd had worse. But because it was so casual. He grabbed her the way you grab a handle. No particular violence in the grip itself, just the absolute certainty that she was an object to be moved, not a person to be persuaded. She pulled back. He yanked harder. She lost her footing on the wet creek bank, and then she was stumbling, and then she wasn't stumbling anymore, because he was moving and she was simply being dragged along. Her bare feet she'd taken off her shoes to keep them dry while she worked skidding over rocks and dirt and the rough edge of the road. "Let go," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was aware of this, even as it was happening. Even as her heel caught on something sharp and she bit down hard on the inside of her cheek not to cry out. Some distant part of her mind had split off and was observing herself, noting her own steadiness as the last thing she had. Pike didn't answer. He was pulling her toward the edge of town, toward the long road that led nowhere anyone wanted to go. People watched from the sidewalks. A woman pulled her child closer, as if Mara were contagious. A man in a good hat turned away and began an elaborate, focused examination of the window display at the post office. 2 older women pressed their lips together in expressions that might have been disapproval, but were aimed, Mara understood, at her rather than at Pike. 30 feet. 50 feet. She stumbled again and went down on one knee, and the gravel opened up her knee through her dress, and she felt it sharp and specific and real, and she thought, this is how it ends. Not with anything dramatic. Just with a man dragging a woman through the dirt while everyone looks at the window displays. And then there was a small voice. "Stop." Pike slowed. In the middle of the road, blocking the path forward, stood 2 little girls. The taller one was maybe 9, dark-haired and serious-faced, with the particular expression of a child who has decided something and is past the point of reconsidering. The smaller one was younger, 6, perhaps, and was clearly terrified, her hands gripping the hem of her dress, her whole small body trembling, but she was standing there. She hadn't moved. She was terrified, and she hadn't moved. "You let her go," the older girl said. Pike made a sound that was almost a laugh. Get out of the road, little girl. No. The older one reached back and took her little sister's hand. The smaller one's grip tightened visibly. You let her go first. There was a moment strange, suspended where the entire street seemed to hold its breath. And in that moment, Mara looked at these two children standing in the road with nothing but each other and some terrible stubborn courage, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt it as a physical sensation, somewhere behind her sternum. It might have been shame that anyone this small had to do what she couldn't. It might have been something else. Then she heard a different set of footsteps. These were unhurried, slow enough to be deliberate. The footsteps of a man who had decided what he was going to do and saw no reason to rush it. He was tall, not in a remarkable way, just the ordinary tallness of a man who'd done physical work all his life and had the posture of someone used to working in open spaces. His face was the kind of face that had been outdoors in Wyoming for many years, which is to say it was weathered and quiet and gave very little away. He was perhaps 30, 32. He was carrying nothing, and he stopped a few feet behind the two girls and looked at Orson Pike with an expression that was not angry. Exactly. It was something quieter than anger. You need to release her arm, he said. Pike's jaw set. This doesn't concern you, Rourke. It does now. Silas Rourke stepped forward until he was beside the girls. He didn't touch them, didn't put his hand on their shoulders or do any of the things that would have suggested he was using them as props. He simply stood there among them as if the three of them were a fact, rather than a confrontation. The girls brought me. Now release her arm. She's being escorted out of this town, and if you know you're dragging a barefoot woman through the street. Silas said it plainly, not with heat. Her shoes are back by the creek. Her hands are bleeding. You dragged her over the gravel there by her wrist, and she went down on one knee. He paused. I can see the blood through her dress. Something moved across Pike's face. Not guilt. Men like Pike didn't feel guilt, exactly. They felt exposure, which is different. He released Mara's wrist. She didn't move immediately. Her body wasn't sure yet what to do with the absence of that grip. Now, Silas said, his voice still quiet. If Red Willow has made its decision about Mrs. Bellamy, that's Red Willow's business. But she needs somewhere to go. He looked at Mara then for the first time directly. His eyes were pale gray, not unkind. You come with us. It was not a command. It was not a rescue narrative. It was not a hero's proclamation. It was a man who had two little girls watching him, who knew what it meant to be left without options, stating a practical solution in a practical tone of voice. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the ways this could be a different kind of trap. She was aware, had been made deeply, permanently aware that men who offered help to women in her situation were often men who had calculated very specifically what that help was worth and what it was going to cost her. She looked at the two little girls. The older one was watching her with the patient expression of someone who had made up their mind that this stranger was worth waiting for. The younger one had stopped trembling. She was looking at Mara the way very small children look at things they've decided to trust, with a totality of attention that is both embarrassing and unbearable. Mara looked back at Silas Rourke. I need my shoes, she said. He nodded. Tessa, he said to the older girl, go get her shoes, please. The girl was already running. That was the first time Mara Bellamy had allowed anyone to choose her in 16 months. She did not know yet what it would cost her. She did not know yet what it would give her. She only knew that her knee was bleeding through her dress, and her wrist had Pike's fingerprints on it in red, and two small strangers had stepped into the road for her when 38 adults with functioning legs had chosen the window displays. She walked back to the creek with Silas Rourke beside her. He didn't speak. Neither did she. There was nothing to say yet. There was only the dirt road and the sound of Red Willow going about its business behind them, and ahead the long open road that led toward whatever came next. Her feet found the shoes where Tessa held them out. Mara took them, laced them, stood. Then she followed Silas Rourke away from the town that had decided it was done with her, with two little girls walking on either side of her and holding her hands like they'd known her all their lives. She did not look back. She already knew there was nothing behind her worth seeing. The cabin was 3 miles from Red Willow, which felt like 300. Mara noticed that first the way the town disappeared behind a long curve in the road, swallowed by the hills, and suddenly there was just the sound of wind moving through dry grass, and the creak of the wagon wheels, and the two little girls sitting on either side of her in the wagon bed, close enough that their shoulders touched hers. Tessa was watching the road ahead, with that same serious expression she'd worn in the street. Ren had fallen asleep against Mara's arm somewhere in the second mile, her small head heavy and trusting, her breath coming in the slow rhythm of a child who had used up all her courage and was now cashing in on exhaustion. Mara didn't move, didn't adjust her position, let the child sleep. Silas drove without speaking. His back was straight on the wagon seat, his hands easy on the reins. He drove the way he'd walked through Red Willow, without hurry, without performance, with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have learned to save their energy for things that actually matter. After a while, Tessa said, without looking at Mara, "Your knee is still bleeding. I know Silas has cloth inside and something for wounds. It smells bad, but it works." "Thank you, Tessa." The girl was quiet for a moment. "Then how long were you in Red Willow?" 2 years. Tessa absorbed this. "Ren and I have been with Silas for almost 1 year," she said, with the careful precision of a child measuring time against something that hurt, "since our mother died." Mara looked at the back of Silas's head. He gave no indication he was listening, but he was. You don't drive a wagon with 2 orphaned children for a year without learning to hear everything. "I'm sorry about your mother," Mara said. "Me too." Tessa said it plainly, without the theatrical grief that adults sometimes perform and expect children to mirror back. Then she went quiet again, and they rode the rest of the way in silence except for the wind and Ren's small, steady breathing, and Mara thought that this was the strangest situation she had been in since Caleb's death, which had itself been the strangest situation of her life, and she had no framework for what happened next, and no energy left to invent one. The cabin was small. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was how maintained it was. The word that came to her was not tidy, not organized, just maintained, meaning someone had made consistent decisions over time to keep it from falling apart. The step-its windows were dark. The step had been repaired with a different wood than the original. You could see the color difference. And the window had a new piece of glass in one corner where something had broken it, and the roof had been patched in at least 2 places. The garden behind the cabin was not decorative. It was working, dense with vegetables she recognized and some she didn't, laid out with the logic of someone who'd figured out what the soil would give and was working within its limits. None of it was beautiful, but all of it was real, and she'd been living around things that were neither for long enough that real felt like a gift. Silas helped Ren down from the wagon first, and the girl woke up briefly and said, "Are we home?" without opening her eyes, and he said yes, and she went back to sleep against his shoulder. He carried her inside, and Tessa took Mara's hand with a matter-of-factness that caught Mara completely off guard, no hesitation, no asking. Just reaching over and taking her hand and pulling her toward the door. Inside smelled of wood smoke and something cooking, and the particular scent of a house that has people in it who are not careful about tracking dirt in from outside, which is to say, it smelled lived in, which Mara had not experienced in many months. Silas put Ren down on a small cot against the far wall and covered her with a blanket, and then turned around and looked at Mara with the same direct, non-committal expression he'd had since the road. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get something for your knee." "I'm fine. You're not fine. Sit down." She sat. Not because he'd told her to, but because her knee, now that she wasn't moving, had begun to throb with the dull, specific insistence of something that needed attention and had been politely waiting, as until she stopped long enough to notice. He brought cloth and a small brown bottle and a bowl of water, and he set them on the table in front of her and then stepped back, which she noticed. He didn't crouch down and take over. He set everything within her reach and stepped back. "The bottle burns," Tessa offered helpfully from the corner where she was already pulling off her boots. "I figured," Mara said. She cleaned her own knee. It did burn. She didn't make a sound. She was aware of Silas moving around the cabin, checking on Ren, stirring whatever was on the stove, and she was aware that he was deliberately not watching her, which was somehow more considerate than anything anyone had done for her in a very long time. When she was done, she said, "What do you want from me?" It wasn't really a question. It was a statement with a question mark at the end, the result of 8 months of calibrating her own position in every interaction she had. Silas turned around from the stove. He looked at her steadily. "Nothing," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got." He set 2 bowls on the table, stew of some kind, heavy with potato, and something she didn't identify. "You can sleep in the storage room tonight. I cleared it out this winter, for when the girl's aunt said she might visit, she didn't. There's a cot in there." He paused. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Mara looked at the bowl. She looked at Tessa, who had appeared at the table and was eating with the complete focus of a child who takes food seriously. She looked at the cot where Ren was sleeping with one arm flung over her head and her mouth slightly open. She looked at Silas. "Why?" she said. He sat down across from her and picked up his spoon. "Eat first, tell me why." He set the spoon down, looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "I know what it looks like when a town has made up its mind about someone," he said. "I've been that person." A pause. "Not here. Somewhere else. Long time ago." She waited. "Eat," he said again. "We can talk later. You need food more than answers right now." She wanted to argue with this. She was tired of men telling her what she needed. But the steam from the bowl was reaching her, and her stomach was doing something humiliating and insistent. And the honest truth was that he was right, and she was tired enough to let him be right just this once. She ate. The stew was not good, exactly. The potato was slightly underdone, and he'd used too much salt and not enough of whatever herb would have fixed it. But it was hot and there was enough of it, and nobody had cooked anything for her in longer than she wanted to count. And she ate 2 bowls and didn't apologize for it. Tessa watched her eat the second bowl with undisguised satisfaction, as if she had personally orchestrated this entire situation, and was pleased with how it was going. That first night, Mara lay on the cot in the storage room, which smelled of dried herbs and old wood, and very faintly of the lavender that someone had clearly put in there intentionally, probably Tessa, and she did not sleep for a long time. She listened to the cabin settle, and the wind move around outside, and the distant sound something that might have been coyotes, and she thought about all the things that could still go wrong, and all the reasons she should leave at first, and all the practical arguments against staying somewhere she had no claim to stay. She fell asleep before she'd finished constructing the last argument. In the morning, Ren was standing in the doorway of the storage room, looking at Mara with an expression of pure scientific interest, the way very small children look at things they are deciding whether to approach. "You're still here," Ren said. "I'm still here." "Good." Ren came inside and sat on the edge of the cot without invitation and looked at Mara's face with that unnerving totality of attention. "Tessa said you might leave in the night." "I said you wouldn't." "Why did you think I wouldn't?" Ren considered this seriously. "Because you didn't have anywhere else to go," she said with the honest practicality of a 6-year-old who hasn't yet learned to soften true things. "And also because I didn't want you to." Mara looked at this small, serious person sitting on the edge of her cot. "That's a very good reason," she said. The first week was careful. Mara made herself useful because she could not stand not to be. She cooked better than Silas, which was not difficult, and she felt guilty, thinking so but thought it anyway, and she mended a shirt of Tessa's that had come apart at the collar. Most of its windows were dark, and she reorganized the food stores in a way that would make them last longer, and she fixed a loose board on the step that had been catching on the bottom of the door every time anyone opened it. She was not doing these things to earn her place. She was doing them because she'd spent 8 months being invisible and useless, and it had nearly finished her, and the only thing she knew how to do with her hands when her mind was frightened was put them to work. Silas noticed but didn't comment. He worked the land from early morning and came in for meals, and sometimes sat on the porch in the evenings and was quiet in the way of people who are comfortable with their own company, who don't require conversation to fill silence. Mara found this strange. Caleb had been a talker. The people in Red Willow had been talkers, or at least they'd filled the air constantly with noise that passed for conversation. Silas's silence was different, not cold, not withholding, just present, like the hills outside or the sound of the creek. It was the silence of someone who said things when he had something to say and did not feel obligated to manufacture words to cover the gap. By the end of the first week, she'd stopped waiting for it to stop. The girls were something else entirely. Tessa attached herself to Mara with a methodical determination that reminded Mara of a mathematician working a long problem systematically, patiently, without panic, one step at a time. She asked questions constantly. Not personal questions. Initially, she had an instinct for the line between curiosity and intrusion that was remarkable in a 9-year-old but practical ones. How do you make bread that isn't heavy? Why do you cut onions that way? Can you show me how to do the stitch you used on my collar? She was learning, deliberately and continuously, and she wanted Mara to be the one teaching her, and this was its own kind of compliment, presented without fanfare. Ren was different. Ren didn't need a reason. She had simply decided that she loved Mara and was proceeding accordingly, with the wholehearted, uncomplicated commitment of a 6-year-old who hasn't yet learned that love is supposed to be complicated. She followed Mara around the cabin. She showed Mara her drawings, which were ambitious and technically chaotic. She asked to have her hair braided the way Mara braided her own and sat very still while Mara did it, which Tessa confirmed was extraordinary since Ren never sat still for anything. Mara braided her hair and felt something in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet, something that she kept her hands busy to avoid examining. 3 weeks in, she and Silas had their first real conversation. It was evening. The girls were inside. Mara had come out to sit on the porch because the cabin felt small suddenly in the way enclosed spaces sometimes do, and Silas was already there, not in his usual way of occupying the porch, but sitting on the steps with his forearms on his knees and looking out at us with something on his face she hadn't seen before. Tiredness, not the physical kind. She sat down at the opposite end of the steps. They were quiet for a minute. "The property tax is due in September," he said, "and the East Field didn't come up well this year." He wasn't telling her this for sympathy. He was just saying a true thing out loud. "I'll manage it." "How?" He glanced at her, apparently surprised by the directness. "I've got some timber I can sell. And there's a rancher 2 valleys over who's been asking about my draft horses for spring work. That's your income for winter, the horses." "I'll manage," he said again, but quieter this time. She looked at the hills. "I want to help. I'm not a charity case. I didn't say you were. Nobody pays me to be here. I'm not earning my keep. You cooked every meal for 3 weeks," he said. "You mended half the clothes in this cabin. You fixed the step, which I'd been meaning to fix for 4 months and kept not doing. You've been teaching Tessa things she'll carry her whole life." He paused. "That's not nothing, Mara." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed it. Said nothing. "I had a sister," he said after a moment. "She was left in a town not unlike Red Willow. Different circumstances, same conclusion. The town decided it was done with her and made that known." He was quiet for a bit. She didn't have anyone step in. Mara waited. "I don't know where she is," he said. "That was 12 years ago. I've looked. The weight of this settled over the porch. The particular weight of an ending that doesn't have an ending. A story that just stopped in the middle and left a hole." "I'm sorry," Mara said. "I'm not telling you to make you feel obligated," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling you so you'll feel like you owe me something." "I know," she said, and she did know. That was the strange thing she did. "I'm telling you because you asked why. Back on that first day, you asked why." He shrugged, a small tight movement. "That's why." She sat with that for a while. The hills were going dark at the edges, that particular blue-gray of Wyoming evenings that looks like someone smudged the horizon with a thumb. "Caleb was a good man," she said finally. "He wasn't enough of one. In some ways I couldn't see until it was too late. But he wasn't cruel, she searched for it. He just didn't fully account for what would happen to me if he wasn't there. A lot of men don't." "No," she agreed, "they don't." They sat there a while longer. The coyotes started up somewhere to the east. Inside, Ren laughed at something, that short explosive laugh she had, that sounded like a small cannon. "She's loud," Mara said. "Constantly," Silas agreed. There was something in his voice, something warm and bone-deep, that he probably wasn't aware of when he talked about those girls. "She gets louder when she's happy. She seems happy. More than when she came." He glanced at the door. Part of that. Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. That was the thing about this porch, this cabin, this strange borrowed life she'd fallen into. It didn't require constant verbal confirmation of itself. It just was. And she was in it. And for the first time since Caleb died, that fact didn't feel like a mistake. 4 weeks after Mara arrived at the cabin, everything changed again. She was hanging laundry on the line, behind the cabin old habit, steady work, the kind of task her hands could do while her mind did something else when she heard the horse. just one, which was unusual. Visitors came on foot or in wagons mostly. A single horse on the road this time of morning generally meant someone with purpose. She didn't go around to the front of the cabin immediately. She finished the shirt she was hanging, and then the pair of trousers, her hands moving on their own, and she told herself the small cold feeling at the base of her spine was nothing, just the morning air. Then she heard the voice, and she knew it wasn't nothing. "I'm looking for a woman named Mara Bellamy." The voice was smooth in the way of men who are paid to be persuasive, not rich, not warm, just professionally even, like a banker's handshake. She'd heard that quality of voice before, in a different context, in the weeks after Caleb's death, when men had come to the house with papers. She came around the corner of the cabin. The man on the horse was perhaps 45, narrow through the shoulders, dressed better than anyone had reason to be this far from any town of significance. His horse was too good for this road. His boots were too clean. He had a face that had learned to show exactly the amount of concern appropriate to whatever situation it was navigating, which meant it showed nothing real at all. Silas was standing in the yard. He'd come out from the field when he heard the horse. He was not holding anything, not threatening in any visible way, just standing with his arms at his sides and that quiet on his face. "She's here," Silas said, simply. The man looked at Mara. Something moved behind his eyes, a quick assessment, the kind that calculates before it speaks. "Mrs. Bellamy. My name is Vernon Sloan. I represent the estate of Mr. Caleb Bellamy, your late husband." He reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." She said nothing. She'd learned that saying nothing in these situations was most from speakings, because speaking gave men like this something to work with. "Your husband contracted a debt before his death," Sloan said. $300, borrowed against anticipated future earnings. The note was held by a private party who has now assigned that debt to me for collection. He held out the papers. "The terms are laid out clearly. You've inherited both the estate and its liabilities." Silas said, "Let me see the papers. My business is with Mrs. Bellamy." "Mrs. Bellamy is on my property," Silas said. "Let me see the papers." There was a long pause. Sloan looked at Silas the way men look at obstacles they've decided to move around rather than through. He held out the papers. Silas took them. He read, slowly, which Mara suspected was deliberate, not because he was a slow reader, but because he was buying time, and because making Sloan wait cost him nothing, and might reveal something. His expression didn't change much, a small tightening around the eyes, once, that she was beginning to recognize as the way he looked when he'd found something. "This is from a court in Cheyenne," Silas said. "Correct. That's a 4-day ride. The court does not require proximity to be valid, Mr. Rourke." Silas handed the papers back. He looked at Mara. "You've never seen this document before?" "No," she said. "Have you ever heard your husband mention a debt of this amount?" "No." He looked back at Sloan. "She needs time to review this. You'll understand we can't simply accept papers from a stranger on a horse without Mrs. Bellamy." Sloan said, stepping past the conversation with Silas as cleanly as stepping around a puddle, "I want to be clear about what I'm offering. The debt is $300. You don't have $300. I'm aware of your circumstances." That smooth professional voice, completely undisturbed. "What I'm offering is an arrangement. You come with me to Cheyenne, work off the debt through domestic service, contracted through my agency. Honest work. You'll be housed and fed. At the end of the arrangement, the debt is discharged." There it was. "You come with me." The words sat in the yard between all of them, and Mara felt it the exact specific weight of them, the way you feel a stone drop into water more than you hear it. She had heard variations of this offer before. Not this particular version, but the shape of it, the manufactured obligation, the solution that required a woman to go somewhere with someone she didn't know, to work off something she couldn't verify she owed. "No," she said. Sloan looked at her with the expression of a man who had heard no many times and had a system for handling it. "Mrs. Bellamy, I understand this is unexpected." I said no. "The debt is legally—" She said no, Silas said. His voice was still quiet. It was, Mara was realizing, always quiet. The quietness was not softness. "And this conversation is done toward for today. You'll leave your papers, and you'll leave the property, and we'll investigate this debt through proper channels." Sloan looked at Silas with the specific look of a man recalculating. He'd ridden out here, expecting a frightened, isolated woman, and found something different. He was adjusting his strategy in real time, and she could see him doing it, the small shifts behind his eyes. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "I understand you need time. I'll return in 2 weeks." He left the papers. He turned his horse. He rode back down the road without hurrying, which was its own message. Men who don't hurry know they'll get what they came for, eventually. Marcia stood in the yard and watched him go and felt the cold thing at the base of her spine spreading. Silas was reading the papers again, more carefully this time. "This isn't right," he said quietly. Not to her exactly. To himself. "I know it isn't. I need to go to Red Willow." He looked up. County records. If Caleb had a legitimate debt of this size, there'd be a record of it somewhere. A note, a contract, something. He folded the papers. These look official. The stamp, the language, someone put effort into these. But the date is wrong. "What do you mean?" "The date on the loan agreement. It's 6 weeks before Caleb died." He showed her. "But the assignment of the debt to Sloane's collection agency is dated 18 months ago. If Sloane's been holding this claim for 18 months, why is he only coming now?" She looked at the papers, looked at the dates. "Because I had nothing worth taking," she said slowly. 18 months ago, I had nothing. Now she stopped. "Now you're somewhere that looks stable," Celeste finished. "Somewhere that looks like there might be resources." The implications settled over them both. "He's done this before," Mara said. It wasn't a guess. It was a recognition, the kind that comes from having been a certain kind of vulnerable, from having learned to read the architecture of predatory systems. "Probably," Silas said. He set the papers on the porch step and looked down the empty road. "I'm going to Red Willow. Pike is in Red Willow." "I know, they won't help you." "They don't have to help me," he said. "County records are public. I just need to read them." He looked at her. "Stay here with the girls. Don't talk to anyone from Red Willow who comes to the property. And if Sloane comes back before I do," he hesitated. "I'll tell him nothing," Mara said. "Tell him I'll be back the following day and we'll discuss it then." He paused. "Don't let him take you anywhere. Whatever papers he shows you, whatever he says, don't go anywhere with him." "I know," she said, and she did know, she had always known. The particular danger Sloane represented was not one she needed explained. She'd been navigating dangers like him, alone, for 8 months, with no cabin and no porch, and no man willing to stand in a yard and say this conversation is done. The difference now was that she wasn't alone while she navigated it. She watched Silas saddle his horse. Tessa had appeared in the doorway of the cabin, taking in the situation with her usual seriousness. "Where's he going?" Tessa asked. "Town," Mara said. "Because of the man on the horse?" "Yes." Tessa was quiet for a moment. "Is that man going to try to take you away?" Mara looked at her. The question was direct, exactly the way Tessa asked everything, without padding. "He thinks he is," Mara said. "Is he going to be able to?" She looked at the road where Silas was already moving, already gone, the dust settling behind him. Then she looked at this 9-year-old girl who had once stood in the middle of a street with her trembling little sister and refused to move. "No," Mara said. "He's not." Tessa nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Mara stood on the porch a moment longer and looked at the papers Silas had left on the step, and at the road, and at the hills beyond. Cold thing at her spine was still there. But it was different now. Less like fear. More like the cold of a morning that's going to burn off by midday, the kind that wakes you up rather than shuts you down. She picked up the papers. She went inside. She sat at the table and read every word of those documents 3 times, slowly looking for everything Silas had found and looking for more. She was no lawyer. She had no training in legal language. But she had spent 8 months surviving on her ability to read situations, to find the thing that didn't fit, to understand systems well enough to know when they were being used against her. She found 4 discrepancies. When Silas came back the following afternoon, his face carrying the particular fatigue of a long, hard ride and a harder set of discoveries, she had all 4 of them written down on a piece of paper in her neat, practical handwriting, with the page numbers and the specific language from Sloane's documents beside each one. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the paper she held out. He read it. He looked at her. "The signature on the original note," he said. "Isn't Caleb's," she said. "I have 2 of his letters upstairs. The signature doesn't match. Someone copied the shape of it, but got the pressure wrong. You can see it in how the pen digs into the paper." Silas sat down slowly. I found 3 other women, he said, in the county records, women who'd had dealings with a collection agency registered under Sloane's name. One of them, a widow named Hartley, I tracked down through a neighbor. She went with him, Mara, 2 years ago. She went with him to Cheyenne to work off a debt she supposedly owed. He set his hat on the table. She's still there. The neighbor gets letters sometimes. She's not coming back. The room was very quiet. Wren was asleep. Tessa was outside, and Mara could hear the light, irregular sound of the girl pulling weeds in the garden. He's going to come back, Mara said, in 10 days. Possibly with legal authority. Possibly with someone who looks like legal authority. What do we do? Silas looked at her across the table. This time, for the first time, there was something in his face that wasn't quiet, something that was close to anger, or the version of anger that burns cold and long rather than hot and brief. I've written a letter to the territorial judge in Laramie, he said. I sent it this morning from Red Willow before I left. I have certified copies of the county record showing no legitimate debt filed in Caleb Bellamy's name. I have your observations about the signature. He paused. And I've written to Mrs. Hartley's neighbor and asked if Mrs. Hartley would be willing to give testimony. Mara looked at him. You did all of that today, Silas. She stopped. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to. He picked up his hat again, turned it in his hands. Mara, I know I didn't have to. She understood what he was saying. She understood it completely, the full weight of it, and she sat with it for a moment, uncomfortable with the feeling of being worth effort. That particular discomfort was its own kind of wound, she realized. The discomfort of being chosen, of someone spending their day, spending their energy, spending some themselves for her. She'd been without it for so long she'd half convinced herself she didn't need it. The letters sat on the table between them, and the afternoon light came through the cabin's single south-facing window and caught the dust in the air. And from outside came Tessa's quiet, steady sound of weeding, and from the far corner came Wren's sleeping breath. And Mara thought, this is a home, broken in several places, uncertain in many others, built by a man who'd lost a sister and raised 2 orphans on 40 acres of difficult Wyoming soil. But it was a home, and someone was trying to pull her out of it. She set her hands flat on the table. Tell me everything the judge would need, she said. Tell me everything we need to prove all of it. Silas looked at her. Everything, she said again. He started talking. She listened, and when he was done, she asked 3 questions, and when he answered those, she asked 2 more, and by the time Tessa came in from the garden with dirt on her hands and a practical question about supper, Mara and Silas had between them the outline of something that was not just a defense. It was a case. And Mara Bellamy, who had spent 8 months being erased by a town that thought it had the power to decide who she was, picked up the pen and began to write. The 10 days before Sloane's return were the longest Mara had lived since the 10 days of Caleb's fever. Not because nothing happened during them. A great deal happened. It was more that every ordinary moment carried an extra weight. The way objects feel heavier before a storm, the specific gravity of something coming that you cannot stop, only prepare for. She cooked. She worked in the garden alongside Tessa. She braided Wren's hair every morning and let the girl chatter about whatever occupied her mind that day, which ranged from the behavior of a particular crow that had taken an interest in the cabin's roof to elaborate theories about what clouds were made of that had no relationship to meteorological fact, but showed a remarkable creative intelligence. She did all of these things, and she was present for all of them, genuinely present, and at the same time, some part of her mind was always on the road, watching for dust. Silas worked. He always worked. But these 10 days, he worked with a different quality of focus, the kind that isn't about the task itself, but about having somewhere to put your hands while your mind does something it can't stop doing. He repaired the fence along the east field. He cut and stacked wood that didn't strictly need cutting yet. He came in for meals and sat across from Mara, and they talked about the documents, about what the judge might need, about the 3 women whose names had appeared in the county records, and in between those conversations they were quiet together, in the particular way that had become familiar over these weeks, the silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to prove anything to each other. The letter from Mrs. Hartley's neighbor arrived on the 8th day. Silas read it at the table while Mara waited. Tessa had taken Wren outside. She had a gift for knowing when adults needed space, that Child, a gift that probably came from having learned very early what adult trouble looked like and how to make herself scarce without making herself absent. She'll testify, Silas said. He set the letter down. Mrs. Hartley. She found a way to get a letter out to her neighbor. She'll testify. How? A traveling minister passed through Cheyenne. She gave him the letter. He paused. She says there are at least 4 other women in that house. All of them brought in through the same arrangement. Mara looked at the letter without reading it. She's been there 2 years. Yes, and she can still testify. She's willing to. Silas folded the letter carefully, the way you handle something that costs someone a great deal to produce. That's not the same as able to. Getting her testimony to the judge before Sloane realizes what's happening. He exhaled. I've written again to Laramie. The judge's name is Alderman. He has a reputation for being difficult, which in this case means he's not someone Sloane will have bought. How do you know that? I asked around. Red Willow has its problems, but it also has people who know things. Ed Collier at the post office has been routing mail through this territory for 20 years. He knows every official in 3 counties. He looked at her. He also told me Sloane has done business in this territory before. Not under Sloane's name. Different names. Same method. Same method meaning what, exactly? Meaning forged debt documents. Meaning women with no family, no resources, no one to question the paperwork. Meaning arrangements that start with a voluntary agreement and end with something that isn't voluntary at all. She sat with that. Collier told you all of this, she said, in Red Willow. He pulled me aside at the post office. Silas had a complicated expression. He watched what Pike did. On the street. He's not a man who would have stepped in. He told me that himself. But he's been carrying it. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, Silas said simply. It's just true. She appreciated that he didn't try to dress it up. That was something she'd noticed about him. Consistently, he didn't manage her feelings. He told her things straight and then let her decide how to feel about them, which was rarer than it had any right to be. On the 9th night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot in the storage room. She'd stopped thinking of it as temporary around the 3rd week. Had started thinking of it simply as her room, which itself was something she tried not to examine too closely. And she went through the documents in her head. All the discrepancies she'd found. All the names Silas had gathered. All the things that would need to be true for the case to hold. She went through it methodically, the way she'd learned to go through difficult problems during the worst of her time in Red Willow, when the only thing she could control was her own thinking. She got up at some point, she didn't know what hour, just that the dark was the particular thick dark of deep night, and went to the table and sat down and pulled the documents toward her and read them again by the light of a single candle. She heard the floorboard at the hallway entrance and looked up. Silas was standing there in the dim, dressed, clearly having also not been sleeping. Sorry, he said. Saw the light. Sit down, she said. He sat. He looked at the documents. She looked at him. I keep thinking about Mrs. Hartley, she said. I know. She went with him willingly. She thought she was settling a debt. Mara turned the papers under her hands. I would have done the same thing. 6 months ago, alone in Red Willow, if he'd come to me, then I would have signed whatever he showed me. Because I had nothing, and he was offering a way out that looked legal. Silas said nothing. I keep thinking about who I was then, she said. How close I was to being her. She paused. I'm not saying I'm better than her. I'm saying the only thing that makes my situation different is that you happened to be in Red Willow that day. You happened to be in Red Willow that day too, he said. And you'd survived 8 months by then on your own. That's not nothing. Surviving isn't the same as being safe. No, he agreed. It's not. They sat in the candlelight and looked at the papers and didn't speak for a while. Outside, the Wyoming night did what it always did, enormous and indifferent and strangely beautiful if you were in a position to notice. I'm going to be on that porch when he comes, Marissa said. Silas looked at her. I'm not hiding inside, she said. I'm not going to stand behind you while you handle it. I'm going to be there. He held her gaze for a long moment. She expected something caution, objection, the well-meaning protective instinct that even good men sometimes couldn't get out of the way of. She'd prepared an argument, a careful and reasonable one, for why her presence was important, why her testimony in her own right was more valuable than her absence, why she was not a person to be kept safe behind a door while her life was negotiated on her porch. All right, he said, just that. She'd been so ready for the argument that the absence of it left briefly without anything to say. "All right," she said finally. He blew out the candle. They both went back to their rooms. And somehow, knowing that she wouldn't be behind a door, knowing that she'd be standing on that porch with her own name in the air, made the remaining hours of the night easier to endure. Sloane came on the morning of the 11th day. Not the 10th, as he'd said the 11th, which was either deliberate or just the arrogance of a man who considered his schedule a courtesy rather than a commitment. He came earlier than expected, too, the sun barely up, still carrying the cold of the night before. And he didn't come alone. 2 men rode behind him. Not Cheyenne men, not any kind of official Mara had seen before. One was broad across the shoulders, with the flat face of someone paid not to think, just to be present and large. The other was thinner, quick-eyed, with the look of a man who kept his hand near his hip by habit rather than by immediate need. 3 horses coming up the road at that hour, in the gray morning light. Mara was already dressed, had been for an hour, sitting at the table with the documents in front of her, and her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She heard them before she saw them. She heard Silas outside already. He'd been up before her, had seen to the horses, had been waiting, and she stood up and took the documents and went to the door and opened it. The cold hit her in the face. She walked across the porch and stood at the top of the steps. Silas was in the yard below and to her left. He had his rifle. It wasn't raised, wasn't pointed at anything. He held it the way a man holds a tool he intends to use for its stated purpose, if necessary, the complete absence of drama in his grip somehow making it more serious than a pointed weapon would have been. Sloane pulled his horse up at the edge of the yard. His eyes went from Silas to Mara and stayed on Mara, Mrs. Bellamy. The smooth voice unchanged. "I'm glad you're still here. I was concerned you might have fled," Mara said. A small adjustment in his expression. Recalculation. "I was going to say made other arrangements." "I made arrangements," she said. "Just not the ones you were counting on." He looked at the documents in her hand. He looked at Silas. He looked at the 2 men behind him, not quite a signal, but close to one a look that said, "Pay attention." "Mrs. Bellamy, I think we can resolve this simply and quickly. The signature on the debt agreement isn't Caleb's," Mara said. Sloane blinked. It was a small movement, but it was real. The first unmanaged thing she'd seen from him. "I beg your..." "The signature. On the original note, the pressure pattern is wrong. Caleb pressed hard with a pen. It was a habit. You can feel the impression through the page. The signature on your document is surface level. Someone copied the shape but didn't know the habit." She held up the papers. "I have 2 letters in Caleb's hand. Written to me. Same signature, different pressure. Anyone who compares them will see it." Sloane was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Mrs. Bellamy, handwriting analysis is not illegal. The date on the assignment is wrong, too," she said. "You took assignment of this debt 18 months ago. Caleb had been dead for 6 months at that point. A debt of this size assigned 18 months ago would have been filed with the county within 30 days. It's a legal requirement. There's no filing." I checked. She wasn't sure she'd checked correctly. Silas had done the actual research, but she'd read his notes until she knew them cold. There's also no record of the original note in the county records. For a debt of $300, there would need to be a recorded lien. Nothing was filed. The broad-shouldered man behind Sloane shifted in his saddle. Most of its windows were dark. The quick-eyed one was watching Mara with an expression that had moved from indifference to something more attentive. Sloane's professional composure was intact. She'd give him that, whatever he was practiced at maintaining his surface. "These are technical questions, Mrs. Bellamy, and they're best addressed in a legal forum." "We agree," Silas said. It was the first time he'd spoken, which is why a copy of these documents, along with certified county records and a letter from a woman named Clara Hartley, has already been sent to Judge Alderman in Laramie. Something happened to Sloane's face then. A small collapse, not of the composure, not quite, but of something underneath it. A structural thing. The look of a man who had walked into a room expecting one configuration of furniture and found a completely different one. "Mrs. Hartley," he said carefully. "Among others," Silas said. "She's not the only woman willing to speak." The quick-eyed man behind Sloane said, "Lo, Vernon." Sloane didn't look at him. Mara stepped down 1 step, and then another, until she was at the bottom of the porch steps, standing in the yard in the cold morning with the documents in her hand and the cold at her back, and 3 men on horses in front of her. She was aware acutely of how this looked a woman in a yard, 3 men on horses, and she was aware of how it had to look from the inside too, how it had felt, in different versions, every time someone had stood between her and something she needed. She was not behind anyone this time. "I don't owe you anything," she said to Sloane. Directly, quietly, with the particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from deciding the fear doesn't get to make this choice. "I never owed you anything. Caleb never borrowed that money. You manufactured a debt for a woman you believed had no one to question it." She paused. "You were wrong." Sloane looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the quick-eyed man, who gave a very small shake of his head. Calculation happening between them that Mara didn't fully have the language for, but whose conclusion she could read the math of risk exposure, of whether what was on that porch was worth what it would cost to push through it. The broad-shouldered man reached for something at his hip. "Don't," Silas said at once, flat, not loud. The rifle didn't move, but something in the quality of his stillness changed, became very specific, very present. The stillness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the other party to make theirs. The broad-shouldered man's hand stopped. Nobody moved. The yard was absolutely quiet, in the way that yards get quiet before something happens or doesn't happen, when the air itself seems to be waiting for information. Sloane looked at Silas, at the rifle that wasn't raised, at the man holding it who wasn't performing anything. He looked at Mara, standing in the yard with her documents and her dead husband's letters but behind her, and 4 weeks of this cabin in front of her, and she looked back at him and did not look away. He pulled his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he said. "It is for today," Silas said, "and today is all we're talking about." Sloane rode. The 2 men rode after him. And the sound of the horses faded down the road, and the dust settled, and the yard was just a yard again, scraped dirt, and the fence Silas had repaired, and the garden coming up in the back, and the cabin behind her with its patched roof and its repaired step, and the particular smell of coffee and wood smoke. Mara's hands were shaking. She became aware of this only after the horses were gone, the trembling in her fingers, the papers rustling very slightly in her grip. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, with the mild, curious attachment of a woman who had been holding herself so still for so long that the shaking felt like an arrival rather than a departure. Silas was beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't offer any of the gestures that would have collapsed the moment into something smaller than it was. He just stood close enough that she could feel the solidity of him, the fact of him, and looked at the road. "Your hands are shaking," he said. "I know. That's normal. I know that too." She pressed the documents against her chest and breathed. The cold air helped. She counted breaths the way she'd learned to do in the worst nights under the porch in Red Willow, the long February nights, when counting breaths was the only way to make time move. After a while he said, "It's not over." "No," Silas agreed. "It's not over. What does he do next? Hard to say. He might push harder. He might cut his losses." Silas turned away from the road. "Depends on what he's got with Judge Alderman. Whether he's in Alderman's pocket or whether he was hoping to avoid Alderman entirely. My guess is the latter." "Why?" "Because if he had the judge, he wouldn't have brought those 2 men. He'd have brought a writ." This was the kind of reasoning she'd been learning from him over these weeks, not legal knowledge, exactly, but the ability to read a situation from its physical evidence, from what people brought with them, and how they held themselves, and what they reached for. It was useful thinking. She'd been doing her own version of it for years, just applied to different situations. "What do we do now?" she said. "We wait for Alderman to respond." He paused. "And we don't let Sloane get to you alone. In town, anywhere. Stay close to the property until we hear from Laramie." She nodded. The door of the cabin opened and Tessa appeared, and behind her, pressed against Tessa's back, was Wren, who had clearly been watching through the window and had now decided proximity to the situation was preferable to the torture of watching it from a distance. "Are they gone?" "They're gone," Tessa said. Wren slipped past Tessa and came down the porch steps and walked up to Mara with total directness and pressed her face against Mara's side and put her arms around her. Not dramatically, just firmly, the way Wren did everything with total conviction and no particular interest in what the appropriate gesture was. Mara put her arm around the small girl's shoulders. I watched from the window, Wren informed her collarbone. I would have thrown a rock if the big one had done anything. I believe you, Mara said. I had one ready. Tessa, still on the porch, said she did. She had a rock in each hand. I had to hold her back. You didn't have to hold me very hard, Renza said with dignity. Mara laughed. It came out of nowhere, that laugh not the controlled, polite sound she'd been producing when appropriate in social situations for years, but something real and startled. The laugh of someone who hadn't laughed in so long they'd forgotten how loud it was, how physical. It surprised all of them, herself most of all. Silas was watching her with something on his face that she didn't examine. She wasn't ready to examine it yet. Go inside, he said to the girls. Let's have something to eat. The weeks that followed were strange in a particular way that Mara would not have been able to articulate while she was living them. Sloane didn't come back, which should have been a relief, and partially was the absence of his horse on the road was a specific daily mercy, but it also created a different kind of tension, the tension of not knowing where the threat had gone, rather than being able to watch it directly. Mara caught herself reading the road too often, caught herself calculating distance and time, caught herself listening to the sound of approaching horses with the alertness of an animal that had learned that normal sounds could mean normal things or could mean something else entirely. Silas sent 2 more letters to Laramie. He got one response, a brief, formal acknowledgement from Judge Alderman's clerk stating that the matter was under review and that additional investigation was being conducted. Not the resolution they needed, but evidence that something was moving. The days shortened. September came. The East Field came in better than Silas had expected, which helped with the tax. He sold the draft horses for spring work to the rancher in the next valley, which helped more. He never said anything about this to Mara, never mentioned money or what she cost or what the additional burden of feeding and housing her meant to the economics of the farm. She knew anyway, because she kept her eyes open and her mind working, and she began doing the accounting in her head, what she contributed, what she cost, where the gaps were. She asked Silas once if she should look for paying work in Red Willow. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, "Do you want to go back to Red Willow?" "That's not the question I asked. It's the one I'm answering." He was mending harness at the table, not looking up from the leather. "Red Willow won't treat you differently just because some time has passed. I know that. So if you go back there looking for work, you'll find the same situations you found before. The same people who've decided what you are." He looked up. "You're not the same person you were 4 months ago. That doesn't mean they'll see the difference." This was true, and she knew it was true. And it also cost her something to hear it, the specific cost of a truth that closes a door. She had no illusions about Red Willow. She just sometimes ran out of some problems to consider in her mind, went back to familiar geography. The way you check a cupboard, is empty because some habit of hoping persists beyond the evidence. "What I should do," she said one evening, after they'd put the girls to bed and she was at the table with the accounts she'd taken to keeping not Silas's accounts, which she kept in a different book, but her own running total of the household. A way of understanding where things stood is figure out how to earn money that doesn't require Red Willow's goodwill. Silas looked up from what he was reading. "Laundry," she said. "I can do laundry. If we could get word to the farms in this valley, there are women out here who need—" "There's a woman named Ada Bryce 2 farms east," Silas said. "She's got 4 children and a husband who's useless about the house. She mentioned to me in September she had no one to help her with the winter sewing." Mara looked at him. "You were saving that. I was waiting for you to be ready for it." This again. This thing he did not pushing, not withholding, just waiting. It was she'd come to understand, not a strategy. It was simply who he was. Silas Rourke was a man who had patience not as a learned virtue but as a structural feature. The way the hills beyond the cabin neck, they didn't decide to be, they just were. She resented it sometimes. Not him, but the patience, the way it always turned out to be right, the way it required her to be the one who moved, who decided, who came to the thing in her own time. It would have been easier, in some ways, to have someone tell her what to do. Easier and worse, and she knew the difference. "Tell me where the Bryce farm is," she said. He told her. She went the following week. Ada Bryce was a compact, practical woman in her mid-30s, with the particular brand of exhaustion that belongs to women who are doing three people's jobs and have stopped being surprised by it. She looked at Mara when Mara knocked on her door with the frank assessment of someone who doesn't have time for social performance. "Silas Rourke sent you," she said. "He told me you needed help with winter sewing. He told you right." Ada looked her over. "I heard about what happened in town. Street and Pike." She said it without particular inflection, not dramatic, just naming a thing. "I wasn't there that day. I want you to know that." "All right," Mara said. "I would have done something," Ada said. "I'd like to think so anyway." A pause. "Can you do buttonholes?" "Yes." "Good. Mine are terrible." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." That was how Mara Bellamy began, quietly and without announcement, to build something outside the cabin. It was not a dramatic reversal. It was one woman's buttonholes, and then a neighbor of Ada's who needed a coat let out for a growing son, and then a letter Mara wrote on behalf of a woman who couldn't read, because she'd discovered during a visit that the woman was being charged twice for a delivery that had only been made once, and the bill was in language she couldn't parse. None of this was large. But large hadn't been on the menu for a long time, and Mara had learned to take the actual thing rather than wait for the version she'd imagined. And through all of it, September bleeding into October, bleeding into a November that arrived in Wyoming with the particular viciousness of a guest who has decided not to wait to be invited. The road to the cabin stayed empty of Vernon Sloan. The letter from Judge Alderman's office arrived on a Thursday. Tessa brought it from the mailbox at the end of the road because she'd been watching for it for weeks. Silas had explained the situation to her in broad strokes, because Tessa absorbed information like soil absorbed water and was dangerous when uninformed, and she came through the door and put it on the table at in front of Mara, with the controlled excitement who knows that controlled. Excitement is more effective than the uncontrolled kind. "It's from Laramie," Tessa said. "Official seal." Mara looked at it. Silas was outside. She could hear him. "Go get him," she said. Tessa ran. Silas came in with his coat still on, Wren appearing from nowhere to crowd the doorway, with her characteristic complete commitment to being wherever things were happening. He looked at the letter. He looked at Mara. "You open it," she said. He picked it up. He opened it. He read. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It moved Winslow's dark. It moved several things in an unguarded way. The face of a man who had kept himself carefully steady for a long time and whose steadiness had just had something removed from underneath it. "Sloan has been served with a formal complaint," he said. "Alderman's office investigated. They found 3 documented cases in addition to Mrs. Hartley." He looked up. "The debt documents are declared fraudulent. The claim against Caleb Bellamy's estate is void." He paused. "And Sloan has been ordered to appear before the territorial court in 60 days. The kitchen was quiet. Wren said, "What does that mean?" "It means," Tessa said carefully, watching Silas's face, "that the bad man can't take Mara." "He was never going to take Mara," Wren said, with absolute conviction. "I had rocks." But Mara wasn't listening to Wren's rocks anymore. She was looking at the letter in Silas's hands and feeling something settle through her body that had not settled in. She counted backward. In 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. The specific gravity of a threat lifting. Not gone Sloan would face his day in court, and that day had its own uncertainties, but gone from here, gone from this road, gone from the space between the cabin and everything she'd begun, tentatively, carefully, to call her life. Her eyes were wet. She was not generally someone who cried easily. The months in Red Willow had used up a great deal of her accessible grief and left a kind of tough scar tissue in its place. But this was not grief. This was something else. The release of a pressure so constant she'd stopped registering it as pressure. The release of something that had been there since the first morning in Caleb's house when the men came with papers, since the day she'd moved out of the rented room, since the night under the Beaumont family's porch. Since the Beaumont family's porch, since the day Orson Pike had grabbed her and dragged her down a street while 38 people looked at window displays. Silas set the letter on the table. He didn't say anything immediately. He pulled out his chair and sat Tess, went quietly to stand beside him, and after a moment, he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him with the ease of long practice. Wren climbed onto her chair across the table and looked at Mara. "You're crying," Wren observed, without alarm. "A little," Mara admitted. "That's okay," Wren said. with the authority of someone who had cried in this kitchen on several occasions and had never been made to feel bad about it. Sometimes things are a lot. Mara looked at this 6-year-old child and this 9-year-old child and the man who had driven them all 3 miles from the worst town, in her experience, to the most unlikely safety she'd ever lived inside. She looked at the letter on the table and the documents she'd compiled and her own handwriting on the list of discrepancies that had helped bring a predator to a judge's attention. She looked at the kitchens with its warrant and its salty stew history and its single south-facing window that caught the afternoon light. Yes, she said, sometimes things are a lot. Silas looked at her across the table with that quiet on his face, and then the quiet shifted not into something performed, nothing like that, but into something that had been there for a while now and had perhaps just stopped waiting for permission to be visible. Something warm and careful and real in the way of things that grow slowly in difficult soil and come up stronger for it. She looked back at him. Outside, Wyoming November pressed its face against the window. Inside, the letter sat on the table between them, with the weight of everything it represented, the fight that was over and the life that was somehow only just beginning. The letter from Judge Alderman's office changed the temperature of the cabin in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to miss. It wasn't that the danger disappeared overnight. Sloan still had his court date, still had 60 days in which anything could happen, and Mara was experienced enough, with the way things went wrong, to know that a man like Sloan didn't simply accept a judge's order and retire from the field. But the specific pressure of him, the daily weight of that road, of listening for hoofbeats, of calculating what she would do if he appeared with a writ, and men who had actual legal standing behind them, that pressure lifted enough that she could breathe differently, could think past the next 3 days, could let herself inhabit the present moment without one eye permanently on the door. What she noticed in the absence of that pressure was how much had been growing quietly underneath it. November deepened. The first real snow came on a Wednesday, early enough in the season to be a surprise even to Silas, who'd lived on this land for 6 years and knew its rhythms. Mara woke to white light coming through the storage room's small window and lay there for a moment not knowing what it was, that particular blank brightness of a snow morning, and then she got up and looked outside, and the world had changed. Overnight into something both beautiful and severe, the hills flattened under white, the sky the flat gray of a fresh page. Wyoming winter, she was learning, was not like any other winter she'd experienced. It didn't arrive gradually, giving you time to adjust. It arrived the way significant things arrive all at once, without adequate warning, requiring immediate decisions about what you were made of. The cabin became smaller in the snow. This was not metaphorical. The drifts came up against the walls on the north side and actually reduced the available light. And you couldn't open the back door for 3 days without Silas going out first with the short-handled shovel he kept specifically for this purpose. Smaller in a way that required everyone inside to negotiate space more carefully, to develop an unconscious choreography of movement that accounted for everyone else. Mara learned that Silas stood at the south window with his coffee for the first 10 minutes of every morning, and she stopped walking through that space during those 10 minutes. Silas learned that she needed approximately 45 minutes in the mornings before she was capable of extended conversation, and he stopped trying to tell her things during those 45 minutes. These were not discussed. They were discovered and adjusted to and incorporated in the way of people who are genuinely sharing space rather than merely occupying the same coordinates. Tessa had taken over a corner of the main room for what she called her school, which was a wooden crate turned on its side, a candle, and a rotating collection of books that she read with the systematic determination of someone working through a curriculum she'd designed herself. She read everything in the cabin. Twice there were 11 books, a fact Mara had memorized without meaning to, and then she read them again in a different order, and she asked questions about what she read that sometimes stopped conversations cold because they were too good to answer quickly. Why did the man in this story give up what he loved most to try to get it back? She asked one evening, looking up from a battered collection of stories with a worn blue cover. Silas thought about it, because keeping it safe felt more important than having it. Tessa considered this, but he lost it anyway. That's usually what happens when you love something so much you start trying to control it instead of being with it, Mara said. without looking up from the mending in her lap. Tessa was quiet for a long time. Then that's very sad. Mara agreed. It is. She felt Silas looking at her. She kept her eyes on the mending. Ren, during these winter weeks, reached a new level of attachment to Mara that even Tessa noted with a mixture of amusement and mild competitive feeling. The 6-year-old had installed herself as Mara's shadow in a way that went beyond the earlier fascination she wanted to do. Whatever Mara was doing, sit where Mara was sitting, sleep under a blanket she designated as Mara's blanket, and therefore special. She brought Mara things: a stone she found interesting, a piece of ribbon, a drawing she'd made of the cabin that had 4 figures in front of it, 2 tall and 2 small, which she gave to Mara without explanation, and with complete certainty that the gift was significant. Mara put the drawing on the wall of her room. She didn't examine why too closely. She was getting better at letting things exist without immediately interrogating them. The difficult conversation happened on a night when the snow was bad enough to make the cabin feel genuinely sealed and the wind working at the corners of the roof with the patient insistence of something that knows it has all the time in the world. Tessa and Ren were asleep. Mara and Silas were at the table, both of them technically doing other things. She was writing a letter for Ada Bryce. He was reading, and neither of them was doing those things very effectively. She set down the pen. "I need to say something," she said. He looked up. "I've been thinking about what happens when winter is over," she said. "When the snow clears and Sloane's court date has passed, and there's no immediate reason to stay in any particular place." She had rehearsed this, and the rehearsal was not helping. "I've been thinking about what I actually want," which is a question I stopped asking myself somewhere around the time Caleb died, because there was no point, because wanting things requires some basic belief that you have the right to have them, and I'd lost that. Silas closed his book. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you should know what you've—" She stopped. Started again. "You gave me back the ability to want things, not because you rescued me. I want to be clear about that. I've thought about this a lot, and what I understand now that I didn't understand in the first weeks here is that what you actually did was give me enough safety to function again. You didn't save me. You just stopped the immediate bleeding long enough for me to remember how to save myself." Silas was very still. "And I want to stay," she said. "That's what I've been trying to get to. I want to stay here. Not because I have nowhere else to go. That's what it was at the beginning. But it's not what it is now. I want to stay because," she looked at the table, "because Tessa showed me her school this afternoon and told me she wants to teach someday, and I felt something I don't have a name for yet. And because Ren gave me a drawing that has all 4 of us in front of this cabin, and because I cooked at this stove every day for 4 months, and I know where everything is, and it matters to me where things are." She looked up. "And because of you. And I'm telling you this directly because I have been indirect about so many things for so long that I don't know how to be indirect anymore, and also because you deserve a direct thing after all of this." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, several things. Quickly, none of them simple. "Say the last part again," he said. "Which part?" "The because of you part." She held his gaze. "Because of you, Silas. Because you drove a wagon for 3 miles without speaking, and let me eat 2 bowls of stew without commenting on it. And because you showed me those documents and stepped back. And because you went to Red Willow for me, and came back with certified records and a letter to a judge. And because you've never once made me feel like a problem you're managing." Her voice caught, slightly, the one place where the composure slipped, which is rarer than it should be. He got up from his chair. She wasn't sure what she expected. Something careful, probably, because careful was his natural state. He came around the table and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and his face had that thing on it again. The thing she'd seen in the kitchen after the letter, the warmth that wasn't performed, and he put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. "I've been trying to figure out how to say the same thing for about 6 weeks, he said. "I didn't want to make it complicated," she said. "Make it something you had to manage," he said. "You'd had enough of managing things that were supposed to be." He stopped. "It's not a debt. I need you to know that. What I feel is not a debt situation." She laughed. Slightly, "I know. Because you've spent a long time around people who called things one name and meant another." "I know, Silas." He looked at her. "I know," she said more quietly. He sat down beside her, close, and they were quiet for a while, with the winter working at the cabin walls and the candle between them burning low. His hand was still against her face. And then it wasn't because she'd turned toward him. And what happened next was not dramatic or swept up. In itself, it was two people who had been careful with each other for a long time in a cold kitchen on a winter night, finally being less careful. Outside, Wyoming did what it always did. Inside, something changed that didn't need naming yet. December arrived, and the cold became geological, not a weather event, but a condition. Constant and absolute, the kind of cold that defines the inside of a house by sheer contrast and makes everything domestic feel precious. The fire had to be fed through the night. The horses needed extra care. Simple tasks multiplied into complicated ones and back into simple ones again, because hardship has a way of clarifying what actually needs doing and eliminating what doesn't. Mara and Silas didn't speak further about what had happened between them, not in the sense of defining it or labeling it or constructing an architecture of expectation around it. They simply continued. Side by side in the kitchen, across from each other at the table, on the porch, when there was a day clear enough to stand outside without freezing, looking at the hills together in the particular silence that had become, over these months, one of their private languages. The girls noticed. Of course they noticed. Ren noticed everything and filtered it through the simple logic of a child who had decided this was good, and therefore it was good. Tessa noticed and said nothing for 2 days, which was unusual for Tessa. And then, on the third day, she found a moment when she and Mara were alone in the kitchen and said, without preamble, "Are you staying?" Mara looked at her. "Yes." Tessa nodded. She went back to her bread dough. Then, after a moment, "Good. Is that all you want to say about it?" Tessa thought about this seriously. "I think," she said, "that if you've decided something important, you probably thought about it more than I have. And you've been alive a lot longer than me." She punched the bread dough with focused efficiency, so I trust it. Mara looked at the back of this 9-year-old's head, the dark hair, straight spine, the complete confidence in her own reasoning, and felt the thing in her chest that still didn't have a name but was becoming familiar. A permanent feature of the landscape of her days. The word came to her in January. She was braiding Ren's hair, a morning ritual now, non-negotiable. Part of the day's structure, and Ren was telling her about a dream she'd had, involving a talking mountain that was also somehow a library. And Mara was listening and working through the braid with the ease of practice, and she thought, this is what belonging feels like. Not the belonging of being accepted by a town or approved of by a community. Not the belonging of fitting into the DC someone else had made for you. The belonging of a morning and a child's hair in your hands and a particular chair that had become your chair and a man in the next room whose coffee routine you knew as well as your own. And 2 girls who had walked into a road for you before they knew your name. She finished the braid. Ren turned around and looked at her with those round, serious eyes. "Mara," she said. "Yes? I want to call you Ma." The kitchen went very quiet in the way kitchens go quiet when something happens that is larger than the room. Mara looked at this 6-year-old girl who had stood in a road with rocks in her hands for a stranger and who had climbed onto her cot on the first morning and announced that she'd known Mara wouldn't leave, and who had given her a drawing, with all 4 of them in front of the cabin, and who brought her interesting stones and lengths of ribbon and bits of the world she found worth noticing. "Have you talked to Tessa about this?" Mara asked. "Yes. What did she say?" "She said she was going to ask you herself." Ren's chin set. "I'm asking first." Mara sat down on the cot to be at eye level with her. This small person, so serious, so certain, so entirely herself. "Where did your mother go?" Mara asked gently. "She got sick," Ren said. "She went away in the night." Her voice was steady. The way Tessa's was steady, a steadiness that came from having worked through something painful enough times that you'd built a path through it. "She's not coming back. We know that. And you know I'm not her. I know that too." Ren looked at her with absolute directness. "But you braid my hair every morning, and you make sure I eat enough, and you laugh at my stories even when they don't make sense, and you put my drawing on your wall." A pause. That's what a ma does. Mara's throat was full of something that made it difficult to speak at normal volume. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "You can call me Ma." Ren threw her arms around Mara's neck with the total commitment of a child who holds nothing back, and Mara held her, and it was not graceful. The way Ren crashed into her, not graceful at all. A small bony body, with sharp elbows and too much enthusiasm, and it was the most real physical thing Mara had felt in years. Tessa appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been listening. She had the expression of someone who had been controlling an emotion for a strategic period of time and had now arrived at the moment when control was no longer required. "Me too," she said, smaller than she usually spoke, that voice. The 9-year-old gone briefly young. "Come here," Mara said. Tessa crossed the room and sat on the edge of the cot and let Mara put an arm around her, and for a moment the three of them were there together, Ren still attached to Mara's neck and Tessa carefully present at her side, and the January light came through the small window, and the cabin was warm with the fire Silas had built before dawn. Mara heard his step in the hallway and looked up. He was standing in the doorway. He'd seen. He had the look of a man who had composed himself very recently and wasn't entirely sure the composure was going to hold. "I'll make breakfast," he said. His voice was rough at one edge. "Silas," Mara said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the two girls against her sides and said nothing, because nothing was necessary. He'd heard. He knew. And the look on his face was something she was going to hold on to for a very long time. He went to make breakfast. Mara sat on the cot with both of them for a few minutes more, until Ren became distracted by the smell of something cooking and left at her usual speed, which was fast, and Tessa sat up straight and smoothed her dress and said, in her regular voice, as if the last 5 minutes had happened to someone else, "Silas burns the eggs if nobody watches him." "Then go watch him," Mara said. Tessa went. Mara sat alone in her room for a moment. On the wall, Ren's drawing with its 4 figures and the cabin. On the window, frost that had come up overnight in patterns. On her wrist, faded but still faintly visible, the place where Orson Pike had left marks in the dirt of Main Street. She looked at her wrist. She thought about the woman who had been dragged through that street, the woman who had eaten half a loaf of bread and planned tomorrow's half, and not been able to imagine a further horizon than that. The woman who'd slept under a porch in February. The woman who had stood in the creek pulling a shirt at its seams and heard footsteps coming and thought, this is how it ends. She thought about that woman, with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite pride, but somewhere between the two, the recognition you feel for a version of yourself you've moved past, when you can see clearly what it cost her and what she managed anyway. She got up. She went to breakfast. The proposal came in February. She hadn't expected it, which surprised her later. She should have, given everything. Given the winter and the conversations and the girls calling her Ma with Silas, standing in the doorway, looking the way he'd looked. But she'd gotten so focused on the present, on the actual daily fabric of this life, that she hadn't been looking ahead for large events. She'd been too busy living to plan for what came next. He found her at the east fence line, where she'd gone to check on a repair he'd mentioned. Needed attention she'd taken to walking the property in the afternoons when the weather allowed it, partly for the air and partly because she'd started to think of the land as something she was in relationship with, something she needed to understand. He came across the field and stopped beside her, and they both looked at the fence for a moment, which did indeed need attention, and then he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right?" "And I want to ask it in a way that makes clear it's a question, not an assumption, not an expectation." He was looking at the fence. A genuine question that has a genuine no available as an answer. She looked at the side of his face. "Ask it." He turned to face her. Wyoming, February behind him, the sky a flat white above the hills, the cold so complete it felt like something you could touch. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not, she noticed, "Will you marry me because you have nowhere else?" Not, "Will you marry me because of the girls?" Not, "Will you marry me because you've been here long enough that it's the logical next step?" Just, "Will you marry me?" Undecorated, clear. She looked at him for a long time. "You said there's a no available." She said, "Yes. I want you to mean that." "I mean it." She stopped, chose the words carefully. "I've had men make offers that looked like questions but had only one acceptable answer built into them. I need this to not be that." "If you say no," he said, quietly but with complete steadiness, "we continue as we are. The girls call you Ma. You have your room. You have this land. That doesn't change." He held her gaze. "I'd be lying if I said it wouldn't hurt, but it wouldn't change anything that matters." She believed him. That was the thing, she actually believed him, which was either a testament to who he was or a testament to how far she'd come or both. And it didn't particularly matter which, because the belief itself was what made the question real. Yes, she said. The words sat in the cold air between them, simple and plain and large. He exhaled once, something leaving his chest that had been held there for a while, and then he stepped forward and put his arms around her, and she let him, in the middle of the east field, with the broken fence and the flat white sky, and the wind moving through the dry grass. Not a grand gesture, not a cinematic moment with music underneath it. Just two people in a field, in winter, in the particular warmth that two people make between them when the world around them is cold. I'm not easy to live with, she said against his shoulder. Neither am I. I have opinions about how things should be organized. I've noticed, and I'm going to keep working. With Ada Bryce and the others. It's not negotiable. Good, he said simply. You're better at half of it than I am. Only half. He laughed short and real. She felt it in his chest. She pulled back and looked at him, and they were both, she realized, smiling the involuntary, slightly embarrassed kind that comes when something genuinely good catches you off guard. The girls are going to be insufferable about this, she said. Ren is going to use the word forever, at least 11 times before supper, Silas agreed. Tessa is going to have opinions about the ceremony. She already has opinions about the ceremony. She told me last week that wildflowers were the right choice, and that anything in a church is too crowded. Mara blinked. She knew you were going to ask? She told me I was taking too long. This was so perfectly Tessa that Mara couldn't argue with it. They married in the spring, when the snow was gone, and the hills had turned the particular green that Wyoming produces for about 6 weeks every year before the summer burns it back to gold. The wildflowers were there. Tessa had been right about the wildflowers. She was frequently right about things, which would either serve her very well in life or make her very difficult to argue with, probably both. The ceremony was small. Silas and Mara, and the 2 girls and Ada Bryce and her husband, and the traveling judge who came through the county twice a year. Tessa stood very straight and very serious at Mara's side and held her hand at the moment that counted with a grip that was probably stronger than a 9-year-old needed to use, but Mara didn't say anything about it. Friend said the word forever 4 times during the ceremony itself and 3 more times at supper, for a total of 7 lower than predicted, but the afternoon was long. The judge asked Mara if she took Silas Rourke to be her husband, and she said yes. And she meant it the way you mean things, when you've earned them the hard way, when you've paid for them in a currency you didn't choose and wouldn't have selected, and will carry the marks of for the rest of your life. Later, when the guests had gone, and the girls were in bed, and the spring night had come down around the cabin, Mara and Silas sat on the porch where Sloane had stood, where she had stood with her documents, and her dead husband's letters, and her refusal to be taken, and they were quiet in the way they'd been quiet for months, the comfortable quiet of people who don't need noise to confirm their presence to each other. Mrs. Hartley, Mara said after a while. Did you hear anything more? The neighbor wrote. Sloane's court date was in March. He was convicted on 3 counts of fraud. A pause. Mrs. Hartley was released. She went back to her family in Colorado. Mara looked at the dark hills and the others, being located. Takes time, I know. She sat with that. The way justice took time, the way damage spread faster than repair, the way systems built to harm particular people were dismantled slowly and imperfectly, always leaving evidence of themselves behind. It's not enough. No, Silas said, it's not. There are other women. Right now tonight, in this territory, who are in the situation I was in, who have no one to question the paperwork. He looked at her. He'd heard something in her voice, a quality that wasn't grief and wasn't resignation, but was the sound of a decision beginning to form. That particular tone she had when her mind was moving towards something she hadn't fully named yet. Yes, he said carefully. She was looking at the hills, and she was thinking he could see her, thinking, the way her face went both still and active at once, the same face she'd had at the table with the documents, the same face she'd had when she'd listed the 4 discrepancies from Sloane's papers in her neat handwriting. We have land, she said. He waited. The Alderman property to the west has been empty for 2 seasons, she said. The Alderman family left for Oregon last fall. It's good land. 10 acres of it are flat enough to build on. She looked at him. We have the money from the draft horse work, and my work with Ada's neighbors has been bringing in. She stopped, recalibrated. I'm getting ahead of myself. No, you're not, he said. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this for weeks, he said. I've seen you thinking about it. I didn't ask because I was waiting for you to get to it in your own time. He paused. What are you building, Mara? She was quiet for a moment longer. Somewhere, she said slowly, where women like me don't have to find a Silas Rourke in order to survive. Somewhere that doesn't require a particular man to step in on a particular day. Somewhere that she looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was both very old and very new at the same time. Somewhere that exists, regardless of who shows up. Where the door is open before they need to find it. The night moved around them. Somewhere across the hills, something called once, and went quiet. Silas looked at his wife, the word still new enough to feel strange in his mind, still requiring a half-second adjustment when he reached for it, and at her face in the dark, with its certainty and its old wounds and its absolute forward direction. Tell me what you need, he said. She turned to look at him fully. Tell me everything you'd need to build it, he said. All of it. Start talking. She started talking. They were there until well past midnight, long after the candle inside had burned down, long after the spring night had turned properly cold around them, and neither of them moved to go in. She talked, and he listened and asked questions, and she answered and revised and pushed further, and the thing that was still nameless began to take shape in the air between them, the way things do when two people are thinking hard, in the same direction, imperfect, unfinished, full of problems that would need solving, real, in the way that only uncertain things can be real, which is to say completely. Inside the cabin, Tessa and Ren slept the deep sleep of children who had found their place in the world and were temporarily not worried about anything. The wild flowers from the wedding were still in the jar on the table, 3 days open now, the edges beginning to turn. On the wall of Mara's room, which was not only her room anymore, but was still where the drawing lived, the 4 figures stood in front of the cabin in Ren's particular style, lopsided, vivid, completely convinced of themselves. Mara kept talking. Silas kept listening. The shape of what would become Willowhaven grew in the spring night, rough and possible and entirely theirs. The Alderman property was in worse shape than it looked from the road. Mara learned this the first morning she and Silas walked the 10 acres together, in early April when the ground had thawed enough to read properly. The flat land she'd identified from a distance turned out to have a drainage problem along its eastern edge, a low shelf of clay that would hold water through the wet months and turn the ground into something you couldn't build on without addressing it first. 2 of the outbuildings that had looked solid from afar had roof problems that went deeper than the shingles. The well was good, which mattered more than most other things, but the fencing was bad throughout. And the main structure, a large house the Alderman family had built optimistically and then abandoned with equal optimism, needed work on every floor before it would be livable for anyone. Silas walked through it all without his face doing much. He had the habit of receiving bad news the same way he received good news, which was quietly and with attention, processing before responding. It's manageable, he said, standing in the main room of the Alderman house with its warped floorboards and its window that had lost its glass on the north side and been boarded over with the wrong kind of wood. You're being generous, Mara said. I'm being accurate. He looked at the ceiling, checking the joists. The bones are good. Everything wrong with it is wrong on the surface. He knocked on a wall. Solid sound. Someone built this to last. They just ran out of time to finish it right. She looked around the room and tried to see what he saw the structure underneath the damage, the shape of the thing beneath what had happened to it. It was, she realized, the same exercise she'd been doing with herself for 2 years, looking past the surface condition to what was actually there. We need money, she said. Not a complaint. A fact to be addressed. Yes. The Alderman family, I heard from Ada that they left owing debts. The land was sold through the county to cover them, which means the purchase price was below what it would normally be. I've already spoken to the county clerk, Silas said. We can afford the land. The building costs are the problem. She'd been thinking about this since the night on the porch, since before that, in the way she thought about complicated problems not in one continuous session, but in the way water moves through stone, finding the cracks and working them slowly until something gives. She'd been awake at 4 a.m. more times than she could count, running numbers in the dark. Ada's neighbor, Mrs. Fenwick, she said. Her husband has a sawmill outside of town. I've been doing letters and accounting work for her for 3 months. She told me last week that her husband owes her a significant favor, and she's been waiting for a reason to call it in. Silas looked at her. I'm not asking you to approve it, she said. I'm telling you what I'm going to ask for. I know you're not asking me to approve it, he said, without offense. What else? Ed Collier at the post office. He told you about Sloan. He's been carrying guilt about the street, about what happened with Pike. Men like Collier carry things for a long time, and they look for ways to set them down. She looked at the boarded window. Lumber isn't the only thing we need. We need labor. You're going to ask Red Willow for labor. I'm going to ask the people in Red Willow who have something to work off. She turned to look at him. Not as punishment, not to make them grovel, but because people who feel guilty are often genuinely useful if you give them something specific to do. Something with their hands. Something that produces a visible result. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's a very particular understanding of how guilt functions. I learned it from experience, she said. I spent 8 months watching people feel guilty about what they were doing to me and do it anyway because there was no alternative offered. Give people an alternative. She stopped. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. He looked at her with that expression she'd come to know, the one that was not simple admiration. She'd have bristled at simple admiration, but something more complicated, the looks of someone who is genuinely learning something from the person in front of them and is aware of it. All right, he said. When do we start? She had already started. The conversation with Mrs. Fenwick happened 2 days later, at Ada Bryce's kitchen table, with Ada present, because Ada had a way of making conversations feel official without being formal, a social gravity that was useful in negotiations. Mara laid out what she needed, what she was offering in return continued accounting work, letters, the practical labor of a woman who had proven over 3 months that she delivered what she promised, and Mrs. Deceive. Fenwick listened with her arms folded and her eyes sharp and then said, What exactly is this place going to be? Somewhere safe, Mara said. For women who have nowhere else. Widows. Mothers with children and no resources. Women who've been left by circumstance in the position I was in. She kept her voice level. There are more of them than people like to acknowledge. They're in every county in this territory. Most of them don't survive it the way I did. They find their own way through, or they don't. I want to build somewhere that changes those odds. Mrs. Fenwick looked at her for a long time. She was perhaps 60, this woman, with the face of someone who had seen enough of the world to be skeptical of most things, and the eyes of someone who had decided, at some point, not to let skepticism become callousness. 2 different choices Mara had come to understand. People confused them constantly. My husband will provide the lumber, Mrs. Fenwick said finally, and don't thank me. Thank him when it arrives. He has more to answer for than I do. Ed Collier came out to the Alderman property on a Saturday, driving a wagon with 3 other men from town, none of whom Mara had expected. One of them was Walt Prescott, who had been standing behind Orson Pike on the day of the street, the livery owner, broad and uncomfortable, who hadn't met her eyes when she'd encountered him briefly in Red Willow the month before. Came out of the wagon without looking at her directly and went to find Silas and said something low, and Silas listened and nodded once. Later Mara asked what Prescott had said. He said he was sorry, Silas told her, and that he didn't know what to do with sorry, so he brought his tools. She thought about this for a while. It wasn't enough sorry, never was. Not for what that street had cost her. Not for what 8 months of that particular variety of community cruelty had taken from her that she'd never fully get back. But it was something. And she was practical enough to know the difference between what she deserved and what was actually available, and to take the actually available thing without pretending it was the other. She went and found Prescott at the east fence line, where he was pulling rotten posts with a methodical focus. Thank you for coming, she said. He looked at her, red face, genuinely ashamed. Mrs. Rourke. Mara, she said, and thank you. I mean it plainly, not as a performance. We need the labor, and I'm glad you're here. He nodded once, turned back to the fence post. She walked away. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a redemption arc for Walt Prescott. She wasn't in the business of managing other people's moral recoveries. It was a fence that needed pulling, and a man who wanted to do something useful with his guilt. And those 2 things had briefly aligned, and that was the entirety of what it was. The building took the rest of the spring and most of the summer. It was not clean work. The drainage problem along the eastern edge cost them 3 weeks and significant physical labor before Silas engineered a solution involving a channel and a berm that redirected the water adequately. The roof on the main house was worse than it appeared, which is the nature of roofs, they always are, and they lost one wall entirely to rot that hadn't been visible from the outside and had to be rebuilt from the foundation. Mara learned things about construction she'd never expected to know, the difference between load-bearing and non-bearing walls, the specific way Wyoming soil behaves. When you pour a foundation in the wrong season, the particular vocabulary of men working together on a physical problem, terse, efficient, almost its own language. She worked alongside them, not as a supervisor and not as a presence performing labor for symbolic reasons, but because there was work to be done and she had capable hands and an improving understanding of what needed doing. She mixed mortar. She learned to use a level. She carried things that needed carrying, and when she couldn't carry them alone, she found someone to carry them with her. And when she didn't know how to do something, she asked, without making the asking into a performance of humility. Tessa came on weekends and helped with a seriousness of purpose that made the adult workers occasionally stop and stare. She was 10 now, approaching it with the focused awareness of a child who understood that 10 was a threshold, not adulthood, but the beginning of the long country between childhood and it. She had started keeping a notebook that she brought everywhere, in which she recorded observations, questions, and what she called plans, which were detailed, specific, and frequently more practical than the ones adults generated. Ren came on weekends too, and was useful in an entirely different way, not through focused labor, but through the particular gift she had for making people feel that what they were doing mattered, that she was watching, and it was important. She brought water to men who hadn't stopped to drink. She found the hammer that got left somewhere. She told Silas his wall looked straight, even when it wasn't, and then told him, actually, it looked a little sideways. And could he fix it? And he fixed it. She was 7 years old, and she ran on confidence and observation and an unshakable belief that things should be better than they were and that she personally had something to contribute to making them so. Mara watched her daughters, the word had become available to her without effort now, arrived naturally when she reached for it and thought about what the world was going to do with two people like this when they were grown, and hoped it was ready. The first woman arrived before the building was finished. Her name was Ruth, and she came on foot, which meant she'd been walking for some time, and she had 2 children with her, a boy of perhaps 5 and a girl of 3, and she stopped at the edge of the property where the new fence was only half built and looked at the activity and the lumber and the partially repaired house with the expression of someone who has been walking a long time and is not sure if what they've arrived at is real. Marisavit saw her from across the yard. She walked over without hurrying, without the performance of welcome that feel as threatening as hostility to someone who's been through enough. "You found us," she said. Ruth looked at her. She was perhaps 30, though the years sat heavily enough that it was difficult to be certain. Her dress was wrong for the weather, too thin for the season, which told Mara she'd left quickly, which told Mara other things. Someone in Red Willow told me. A woman at the general store. She said there was a place being built. She said she stopped, looked at the children. She said nobody has to prove anything to get in. "That's right," Mara said. "I don't have money, I heard you." Ruth looked at her with the specific wariness of a person who has been told things by strangers before and learned what that cost. "What do you want from me?" Mara had been waiting for this question, had been prepared for it, because she had asked it herself in a different yard, to a different person, in a different season. She knew the weight of it. She knew what it cost to ask it, the exhaustion behind it, the damage behind that. "Nothing right now," she said. "Food first. Then we'll figure out what comes next." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. The boy leaned against her leg. The little girl had her face pressed into her mother's skirt. "All right," Ruth said. The same word Mara had said that first day, on the wagon, driving away from Red Willow. Just that, all right. They went inside. The news about Orson Pike came in September, 7 months after Mara and Silas had married, 4 months after Ruth arrived, 2 months after a second woman named Helen came with her teenage daughter, 3 weeks after a girl barely 20, whose situation Mara didn't ask about immediately and whose story arrived in pieces over several weeks, as stories do. when the person telling them needs to test the safety of each part before committing the next. The news of its windows were dark. The news came through Ed Collier, who brought it out to the property in person rather than sending a letter, which told Mara before he opened his mouth that it was significant. Pike's story, Collier said, standing at the porch with his hat in his hands, in the way he'd developed over these months of occasional contact, a gesture that had started as discomfort and become something more like respect. He's selling it. Moving his family to Denver, the word is. Mara waited. His sons have been having trouble, Collier said carefully. The oldest one was involved in something down in Laramie. Legal trouble. And when Alderman's Court went public Sloan's case, some things came out about the way Pike ran his council seat. Favors he'd called in. Decisions he'd influenced. Collier looked at his hat. He's not being charged with anything. But Red Willow has made its position clear. What position, Mara said? That he should go. Collier looked up. Some people feel that what happened, what he did, the street, all of it, that it's connected to the kind of town they want Red Willow to be. Or don't want it to be. He paused. I'm aware that's not justice, Mrs. Rourke. I know that. A man losing his business is not the same as what he cost you. No, she said. It's not. But it's something. She looked at this 60-year-old man with his hat in his hands who had told Silas the things that helped build a case, and who had carried guilt like a stone in his coat for over a year, and who had come out here in person to tell her this because he'd decided she deserved to hear it from someone rather than stumble across it. It's something, she agreed. After he left, she stood on the porch for a long time. Inside, she could hear Ruth telling the children something, and Helen's daughter laughing at whatever it was, and the sound of Tessa's voice explaining something with her characteristic patient precision. Normal afternoon sounds. The sounds of a house with people in it who had found their way to the same place from different directions and were, imperfectly and sometimes difficultly, figuring out how to share the space. She thought about Orson Pike leaving Red Willow. She had imagined in the worst months of her life various versions of what justice would look like. And those of its windows were dark. In those imagined version, a public confrontation, a clear verdict, a moment where everyone who had watched from the sidewalks was forced to acknowledge what they'd watched. She'd given up on those imagined versions because life didn't produce them, and holding out for the dramatic version of justice meant never being available for the actual version, which was usually quieter and messier and more partial and real. A man losing his store and his council seat and leaving his town under a cloud was not the reckoning she'd once wanted, but it was a reckoning. And she was still here, on her porch, with her name on the land behind her and her family inside it, and he was leaving. She could live with that. She'd learned to live with a great many things. The harder thing happened in October. A man came to Willow Haven looking for one of the women. Not Sloan was in a territorial prison by then, which Alderman's clerk had written to confirm in a brief official letter that Mara had read 3 times before putting it in the box she kept for important documents. This was a different man, a husband, who had heard from someone in the county that his wife had gone to the Rourke place and he wanted her back. He arrived in the afternoon when Silas was in the back field and Mara was at the house. He was not physically large. He had the particular quality of a man who knew how to be unintimidating in public while being something else entirely in private. And Mara read this in his face within the first 30 seconds of looking at him. "My wife is here," he said. "Her name is Helen. I'd like to speak with her." "Does Helen want to speak with you?" Mara asked. Something moved in his expression. He was practiced at controlling it. "I'm her husband. She doesn't have to want to. It's not a social call. It's a family matter." "This is a private property," Mara said. "You're welcome to wait here while I ask Helen if she'd like to come out and speak with you. I'm not waiting on my wife's permission to—" "You're waiting on mine," Mara said, "to be on this property." He looked at her with the specific look men use when they're recalibrating, when the situation is different from what they prepared for and they're deciding between the options available to them. She held the look without stepping back or softening her face. He waited. She went inside. Helen was in the kitchen. Her daughter was nearby. Mara told her, plainly and quietly, that her husband was at the gate and that said he wanted to speak to her and that he wasn't getting past the gate without Helen's explicit decision, and that explicit decision included no, and that no was a complete answer that Mara would enforce without further discussion. Helen went white, then gray. Then something firmed up in her face, the same firming Mara had seen in her own face, in mirrors, the expression of a woman who has been frightened for so long that the fear has become structural, load-bearing, and is now being asked to consider what might hold things up in its absence. I don't want to see him, Helen said. All right, Mara said. Stay here. She went back to the gate. Helen doesn't want to speak with you today, she said. She has every right, Marcia said. This is not your house. She is not your property. She's a person who has made a decision about where she is and who she speaks to, and that decision is hers to make. She looked at him directly. I'm asking you to leave now. If you come back without her invitation, I'll be sending a letter to Judge Alderman's office, whose clerk I correspond with regularly, describing the circumstances. The mention of Alderman's name did the work she'd hoped it would. Sloane's case had made Alderman known in the territory in a way that was useful not as a magic word, but as the name of someone who had demonstrated a willingness to act, and men who preyed on women in private generally preferred officials who didn't act. He left. Not gracefully, but he left. She stood at the gate and watched him go, and her hands were not shaking this time. That was the difference, her hands weren't shaking. This was not because she wasn't afraid, exactly, but because fear and function had finally been separated in her, the two things untangled from each other so that one could exist without preventing the other. She could be afraid and still stand at the gate. She could be uncertain and still say the words that said saying. She'd learned this, she thought, specifically and through practice. The way you learn anything real, not from being told, but from doing it badly first, and then doing it slightly less badly, and then one day doing it in a way that feels, if not natural, at least available. Helen appeared in the doorway of the house, watching from a distance. Mara walked back across the yard and up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. He's gone, she said. Helen looked at the empty road. He'll come back. Maybe, Mara said honestly, but we'll handle it the same way. And if he comes back enough times, Alderman's office will handle it differently. You really write to a judge's office. Regularly, Mara said. It started as a necessity, and it's become something else. She paused. There are laws, Helen. They're not always applied the way they should be, but they exist, and knowing them is power that nobody can take away once you have it. She looked at her. I'm going to teach you what I know, if you want. Helen looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said, I want. The inheritance arrived in November with a letter. Mara read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, the way she read things that seemed too significant to absorb on a single pass. The man who delivered it was a lawyer from Cheyenne, a dry, precise man in a good coat who had clearly ridden a long way and wanted to conduct his business efficiently and return to somewhere with better roads. The letter was from a distant relation of Caleb's family, an uncle Mara had met once, briefly, at the wedding, a man named George Bellamy who had made money in land speculation in the decades since, quietly and without particular drama, and who had died the previous spring without direct heirs. The estate had been divided among the family. Mara's portion was $15,000. She sat with this number for so long that the lawyer cleared his throat, gently, to confirm she was still functional. I understand this is unexpected, he said. Yes, she said. The legal process is straightforward from here. You'll need to. Give me a moment, she said. He gave her a moment. She looked at the number on the paper. $15,000. More money than she'd seen in her life. More money than she'd imagined as a possible fact rather than an abstraction. More money than the sum total of everything she'd lost: the house, the savings, the 2 years of scraping and scavenging, the months under porches and in hay barns, the cracked knuckles and the hungry days and the 38 people looking at window displays. She thought about what she'd told Silas on the spring porch, the night they'd talked until midnight about the shape of something that didn't have a name yet. She thought about Ruth and Helen and the young woman whose story still came in pieces. She thought about the drainage problem on the eastern edge that they'd solved, but that had revealed there was another field south of it that could be workable with the right investment. She thought about the main house, which was livable now but still smaller than what was needed, and about the second building they'd sketched plans for and then set aside because the money wasn't there. She thought about Tessa, who wanted to teach, who had the mind for it and the patience for it, and who needed more education than the cabin and Mara's accumulated knowledge could provide. She thought about what it meant to build something that could survive beyond the people who built it. She signed yes. When Silas came in from the field that evening, she put the document on the table in front of him and let him read it. He read it, set it down, looked at her. What do you want to do with it? He asked. Not, what should we do? Not, here's what I think. What do you want to do with it? The question directed at her, because it was hers the money, decision, the right of its windows were dark, to determine what happened to something that had arrived in her name. Willow Haven first, she said, the south field. The second building we planned it out. We know what it costs. That gets built first. She looked at the document. And Tessa, she needs proper schooling. Not what I can give her. There's a teacher's college in Laramie. She's 2 years away from being old enough to apply, and she's already doing the reading for it. Mara looked up. I want to set aside what she needs. For that, as a certainty, not a hope. Silas looked at the table for a moment. She's going to act like it's nothing, he said. When you tell her, she's going to nod and say that makes sense, and then go very quiet for about 4 hours, and then come out of her room with a list of questions. I know, Mara said. That's how she does everything. He was right. That was exactly how it happened. Wren, by contrast, understood the news to mean that the house was getting bigger, and responded to this with uncomplicated and total enthusiasm, and immediately began drawing diagrams of where she felt the new rooms should be, which were architecturally impractical, but showed a strong instinct for how people wanted to move through spaces. The second building went up the following spring. Silas managed the construction with the help of men from 3 farms in the valley, not guilt labor this time, just neighbors who'd seen what was being built and decided they wanted to be part of it. The south field was drained and planted and showed better soil than the eastern field once it was properly worked. By the end of that second year, Willow Haven could house 12 people comfortably, and more in the summer months when the weather permitted. Women arrived the way Ruth had arrived, on foot, by wagon, occasionally by horse, occasionally brought by someone else who had hers, and thought of someone who needed it. They arrived frightened, most of them. They left, most of them, differently. Not transformed, Mara was skeptical of transformations, which seemed to her a way of demanding that damaged people become someone else entirely rather than being supported in becoming more fully themselves. But equipped, with work, with some money of their own, with knowledge of the laws that applied to their situations, with the specific practical skills that turned out to matter enormously once you had them, how to write a letter that got read, how to read a contract, how to identify a fraudulent document, how to find the alderman in whatever county you landed in. Mara taught these things herself, and she was a demanding teacher, which surprised people who expected someone in her position to be primarily gentle. She was not primarily gentle. She was precise and direct and high expectation, and she said so clearly at the beginning, I'm not here to make you feel better. I'm here to make you harder to beat. Several women didn't like this approach. A few left. Most stayed, and those who stayed had something to show for it. Red Willow watched from its 3 miles away. The watching was complicated. Some of it was hostility. There were people in town who found the existence of Willow Haven threatening in a way they struggled to articulate, who said things like it attracts the wrong element and it undermines the proper order of things, which Mara translated without difficulty into it, makes women harder to control, and this makes us uncomfortable. She didn't argue with these people. She had learned that some arguments aren't worth having, and that the best response to people who resent what you're building is to keep building. But some of the watching was different. The general store that had replaced Pike's, run by a younger man named Carter, who had moved to Red Willow from further east, and who had no particular history with Mara, began setting aside certain goods at cost for Willow Haven. No announcement, no drama. Just a note through Ed Collier that said certain supplies would be available at different pricing going forward, and no further discussion of it. 3 women from Red Willow itself came to Mara over the following year. Not as residents, they had homes, technically, but for the other thing, the teaching, the contract reading, and the letter writing, and the slow building of a practical literacy about systems and rights that the town had never seen any reason to offer women before. Mara taught them the same way she taught everyone else. One of the 3 was the wife of a man who had been standing on the sidewalk that day, watching. Mara knew this. The woman knew she knew. Neither of them mentioned it. The woman came every week for 4 months, and she learned what she came to learn, And at the end of the 4 months, she said quietly, without making a production of it, "I'm sorry about what happened on that street." Mara looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Come back next week. We're starting on property law." The woman came back. Tessa left for Laramie on a September morning, 3 years after the inheritance arrived. She was 13 too young, technically for the teacher's college, but her entrance examination had produced results that the college's director had written about personally in a letter that Tessa received and read twice, and then put in a drawer and didn't mention for 2 days, which was her way of processing things that were larger than she wanted to show. She packed with characteristic efficiency. She made a list. She crossed off the list as she went. She came and found Mara the evening before she left, and they sat on the porch together. The porch, that had now been the site of more significant conversations than Mara could count, and Tessa said, "I'm scared." "I know," Mara said. "I don't show it very well." "You show it the way you show everything," Mara said, quietly, and after thinking about it for a while. Tessa looked at the hills. "What if I'm not as good as the examination suggested?" "You probably aren't, in some ways," Mara said. "Examinations test certain kinds of knowing. There are other kinds. You'll find out which ones you have and which ones you need to develop." She paused. "That's what going somewhere is for." "That's not very comforting." "No," Mara agreed. "But it's true, which I thought you'd prefer." Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then, in a smaller voice, "What if I miss home?" Mara looked at this 13-year-old girl who had stood in a road for a stranger and who had asked, "Are you staying?" before she asked anything else, and who had been keeping notebooks for years and who wanted, above all things, to teach other people what she knew. "Then you'll miss it," Mara said. "And you'll write, and we'll write back, and the missing will be part of knowing that you have somewhere that's worth missing." She put her arm around Tessa's shoulders. "That's not a problem, Tessa. That's the whole point." In the morning, Silas drove her to Red Willow to catch the stage to Laramie. Wren cried loudly and without self-consciousness, which was her way. Mara stood at the gate and watched the wagon go, and did not cry until it was around the bend. And she was alone at the gate, and the road was empty. And then she cried for about 3 minutes, which felt like the right amount. Then she went back inside and found Ruth at the table with 2 of the newer women and a legal document that needed reading. And she sat down and began. Years passed the way years do when you are living them rather than waiting for them, not fast, not slow, but present, accumulating into a shape that could only be seen from some distance. Wren grew into a young woman who was, as promised, fiercely independent and constitutionally incapable of watching an injustice without doing something about it, which caused problems occasionally and solved more. She took over the daily management of Willow Haven at 16 with a competence that surprised everyone except Mara and Tessa, who had both seen it coming. Tessa came home in the summers, and at the end of her 3rd year, she came home with a teaching certification and a job offer from a school 2 valleys over, which she accepted, and which meant she was close enough to come for Sunday suppers, which was what she'd wanted all along. She taught, as everyone who had paid attention had known she would, with great patience and high expectations, and a gift for making the people in front of her feel that she believed they could do more than they thought they could. She had learned this somewhere. She knew where. The morning came when Mara stood on the porch of Willow Haven and looked out at the land and tried to understand what she was looking at. It was spring again, the particular Wyoming spring that never quite arrives when expected, that comes in starts and retreats, that requires patience and then rewards it suddenly and completely. The hills were the temporary green. The garden was coming up in the orderly rows that several women had planted together over the course of a week, an activity that had become something more than practical in the doing of it, the specific penmanship of work done shoulder to shoulder with people who ask nothing from you except that you show up. From inside came the sound of voices, the particular morning sound of a house with people in it. Ruth's voice, still here after all these years, steady and certain in a way she hadn't been when she'd arrived at the gate with 2 children and a dress too thin for the weather. Her children, now the boy was 10, the girl 8, and they had grown up in this house and considered it the realest place they'd ever been. Wren somewhere, talking at her usual volume, which had not decreased with age. Silas came and stood beside her. He was 40 now, which had arrived on his face, the way things arrive on people who have spent their lives working outdoor land, not harshly, but honestly, the years visible and not apologized for. He stood beside her and looked at the same land she was looking at, and neither of them spoke for a while. Tessa's coming Sunday, he said eventually. I know. She's bringing a friend from the school. I know that, too. He looked at her. You're thinking about something. I'm always thinking about something. You're thinking about that street, he said. Wasn't a question, she was. She did sometimes, still not obsessively, not in a way that prevented anything, but the way you return to a scar sometimes to check that it's healed correctly and to remember what caused it, because forgetting entirely seemed like its own kind of dishonesty. I was thinking about what it was like to believe that belonging was something other people gave you, she said, that it was in their power to give or take away, that you had to be approved of and accepted and deemed worthy before you could exist in a place. Silas waited. I believed that, she said, for a long time. Even before dark, even before Red Willow, I believed it in the way you believe things you've absorbed so slow, so early that they feel like facts about the world rather than ideas that someone decided. What changed it? She thought about two little girls in a road, about a wagon seat and a bowl of stew and the deliberate act of stepping back, about a table and documents and her own handwriting listing 4 discrepancies, about standing in a yard in the cold morning holding Caleb's letters and saying, I owe you nothing, to a man on a horse. Practice, she said, doing things before I was sure they were going to work and finding out that some of them did and some of them didn't and that I was still standing either way. She looked at the land and having people beside me. That too, I don't want to be dishonest about that part. Having people beside me made it possible. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, the deciding that you matter. You need someone to act like you matter first, until you can do it for yourself. He took her hand. She let him, and she thought about the wrist that had once carried Pike's bruises, and the dry creek bank, and the shoes Tessa had run to retrieve, and the long road out of Red Willow that had turned, impossibly, and through an accumulation of small choices rather than a single dramatic turn, into this porch and this land and this life. She had not become a person who no longer carried what had happened to her. Var Keen. She had become a person who carried it differently, who had built something strong enough to carry it in, so it didn't have to be carried alone. Behind her, inside the house she had built, women who had arrived frightened were learning to read contracts. Children who had arrived, clinging to their mother's skirts, were running through a garden that produced more than enough. A woman named Ruth, who had once stood at a gate and asked, "What do you want from me?" was now the one who opened the gate when new arrivals came. The town of Red Willow existed 3 miles to the east. It had changed incompletely and imperfectly, and at the pace that towns change, which is to say slowly and with resistance and not always in the direction you hoped. But it had changed. The street where Orson Pike had dragged a barefoot woman through the dirt while 38 people watched now had a woman teaching reading to children 2 afternoons a week, Tessa's colleague, most of its windows, who'd heard about the valley from Tessa and decided she wanted to be where things were being built rather than where they were being left to fall apart. Small, all of it small. That was the thing nobody told you about building something real. It was always smaller than you imagined it would be. Slower, more partial, more compromised by the limits of what was actually possible on any given day. The story people told about you afterward was always cleaner than the living of it, but the living of it was what was real. Mara stood on her porch in the Wyoming spring and looked at the land that had been the worst idea she'd ever heard articulated in a kitchen at midnight, and at the house that had been a drainage problem, and a rotten wall, and wrong season concrete, and too many months of her own determination and other people's guilt labor, and at the garden that was coming up imperfectly in the rows that multiple pairs of hands had planted together. She looked at all of it. She thought, I built this. Not alone. Not perfectly. Not without cost, without loss, without the marks that living leaves on a person, whether they consent to them or not. But she had stood in a creek bed losing her shoes, and she had driven 3 miles in a wagon, and she had eaten 2 bowls of salt-heavy stew, and she had read documents in candlelight, and she had stood in a cold yard and said, I owe you nothing. And she had been believed when she said yes, and she had taught women to read contracts, and she had sent a daughter to college. And she had stood at a gate and said, this is a private property. And she had done all of these things, one after the other, imperfectly and sometimes afraid, and the accumulation of them was this porch and this land and this life. Belonging was never something Red Willow had the power to give. She had claimed it herself, one small, stubborn, irreversible choice at a time. Silas was still holding her hand. Inside, Wren was saying something in that carrying voice that had not diminished in 30-something years of use. Spring light came across the valley the way it always did here, slanted and generous, finding everything. "Come inside," he said. "Wren is going to burn the eggs again." "She does it on purpose," Mara said. "She likes them that way." "I know. But she's going to try to convince everyone else they do too." Maris the Noir. Mara laughed, the real kind. The kind that still surprised her sometimes with how available it was, how it arrived without being summoned, and she turned away from the land and went inside to her family. The door of Willow Haven opened behind her, as it did every morning, for whoever needed to come through. It would stay open. She had built it that way.